The darkness in the room thickened as Rania felt a cold shiver run through her. Her hands involuntarily brushed the page of an old book on Christianity when suddenly, the candlelight flickered and went out. A strange presence hung in the air like someone was standing behind her. In that moment, something shifted inside her, squeezing her heart. Chapter 1. The Time of Shadows. Rana, the daughter of a high-ranking Turkish general, lived in a world defined by strict rules and expectations. She was raised in a family where honor, tradition, and religious devotion were of paramount importance. From a young age, she was taught that her life did not belong to her, but to her family and to the service of Muslim ideals. Her father, the general, was unwavering in his loyalty to the state and to Islam. He demanded from his daughter absolute obedience, respect for their ancestors, and strict adherence to the social norms accepted in their society. Every day for Rana began with prayer. The sounds of the adhan from the mosque near their house echoed through the early morning air, marking the start of her daily routine. She would kneel on the soft prayer rug in her room, her head bowed, fingers moving over the beads of her tasbih as she whispered her devotions. The prayers filled her with a strange peace, but as she grew older, they also began to feel more like a ritual of duty rather than genuine connection. After the morning prayers, she would quickly prepare for her lessons. Her education, though privileged, was rigidly controlled. She studied religious text, history, and the sciences, but it was clear that her intellectual development was secondary to her role. As a daughter in a respected family, Rana had no time for friends, no room for personal interests. Her family's expectations were all-consuming. She was expected to maintain a dignified silence, to be a reflection of her father's honor and his unwavering commitment to Islam. Her life was dictated by the unseen threads of tradition, and the walls of her home, though grand and filled with treasures, felt increasingly suffocating as she grew older. The house was full of servants and guards, each one aware of their place, each one ensuring that Rana adhered to the rigid rules of their world. The family's villa, large and imposing, was surrounded by high gates, its interior decorated with intricate tapestries, polished marble floors, and the rich scent of oud. The air inside was heavy with unspoken expectations. In the evening, after completing her studies, Rana would retreat to her room, where she sat in the stillness, staring at the ornate tapestries hanging on the walls. The room was meticulously arranged with shelves of books, but none of them brought her the comfort she longed for. The knowledge she absorbed felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle she could never quite put together. She often felt the weight of isolation, even in the presence of her family. She was constantly aware that her actions were being scrutinized, that even the smallest deviation from the prescribed path could bring shame to her name. Despite the constant presence of others, Rana often felt alone. Her father, though loving in his own way, was distant and cold in his affections. He believed that the only way to protect his family's honor was through strict control. His love was wrapped in layers of duty, discipline, and an unwavering belief in the strength of tradition. Rana knew that disobedience was unthinkable, and so she never dared question the life that was being carved out for her. She knew her future would be shaped by her father's decisions, and her role was simply to follow. But as the years passed, a quiet rebellion began to take root inside her. It was not the kind of rebellion that could be voiced or acted upon, but a silent, growing unrest that gnawed at her. She felt trapped within the walls of her own life, unable to breathe freely, unable to see beyond the expectations placed upon her. She longed for something more, but she couldn't name it. It was a yearning for something that lay outside the carefully drawn lines of tradition, something that stirred deep within her soul, but she had no idea what it was or where it would lead her. One afternoon, while wandering through the vast library of her father's home, Rana happened upon a set of old books hidden in a forgotten corner. They were written in a language she could barely understand, but the titles intrigued her. As she pulled the books from the shelf, she noticed the faded leather covers, their edges worn from years of neglect. These books were different from anything she had been taught to read. They were not filled with the rigid doctrines of Islam, but with stories and teachings that felt foreign and strange. Rana's heart skipped a beat as she opened the first book. It was about Christianity, a religion that she had always been taught to view with suspicion. She had heard of it, of course, but only in the context of its differences from Islam. Christianity was considered a misguided faith, one that had strayed from the true path. But as Rana flipped through the pages, she found herself drawn to the words. The teachings were filled with a kind of love and compassion that was unlike anything she had encountered in her own faith. The words spoke of sacrifice, of forgiveness, of a love that transcended all boundaries. Her hands trembled as she read. The concepts were so foreign to her, yet they stirred something deep within her heart. She could feel the warmth of the words, a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, distant teachings she had grown up with. She didn't fully understand everything she was reading, but something in her soul responded to it. It was as if she had uncovered a hidden part of herself, a part that had been buried for years beneath layers of expectation and tradition. Rana began to read in secret, devouring the books when no one was around. She hid them under her bed, tucking them away in the darkness, afraid that anyone might find out what she was doing. The more she read, the more she felt a growing dissonance between what she had been taught and what she was discovering. The teachings of Jesus, the idea of unconditional love, forgiveness, and grace, began to resonate with her in a way that nothing in her own faith had ever done. It was as if she had stumbled upon a truth that was too beautiful to ignore, but too dangerous to embrace openly. She found herself torn between two worlds. On one side was the life she had always known, the life of duty and submission, the life that had been carefully crafted for her since birth. On the other side was something new, something that promised freedom, peace, and love, but at a cost she could not yet fathom. Rana knew that embracing these new ideas would mean risking everything: her family's honor, her father's approval, and her place in society. It would mean walking a path that was forbidden, a path that could lead her to ruin. But as the days passed, the pull of these new teachings grew stronger. She began to question everything she had been told, everything she had been taught to believe. The more she read, the more she felt a sense of liberation, as if she was finally uncovering the truth hidden beneath the layers of tradition and fear. She knew that she could not continue living in the shadow of doubt forever. Something had to change. But what? What was she willing to sacrifice for this new truth? Rana's struggle became a quiet battle within her. She could no longer ignore the yearning that burned inside her. She could no longer deny the love and hope that these teachings offered her. And so, in the dead of night, when the house was silent and her family slept, Rana made a decision. She would go further. She would take a step into the unknown. She would leave behind everything she had known, everything she had been taught, and embrace a new path. A path that led her to something greater, something more beautiful, something that could fill the emptiness she had carried for so long. But this decision would come with a price. The price of her father's wrath, the price of losing everything she had known, the price of stepping into the light, where shadows no longer held power over her, the price of her freedom. And so, Rana stood at the precipice, trembling with both fear and hope, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but believing that it was the only path worth walking. Rana's life had always been controlled by external expectations, her father's unwavering authority, the weight of tradition, and the constant presence of a community that demanded conformity. But despite the outward calm, an inner turmoil had been growing inside her. Every day, as she went through the motions of her well-structured life, she felt herself drifting further away from the world she had been raised in. The rituals, the prayers, the strict adherence to the rules, they all seemed to suffocate her soul. The more she conformed, the more disconnected she became from herself, and the emptiness inside her deepened. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, but who was she truly? This question haunted her every day, and no matter how much she prayed, she couldn't find the answer. The weight of tradition was like a constant shadow, hanging over her, and it became harder to ignore. The more she studied her religion, the more she questioned its teachings, not out of rebellion, but out of a deep and desperate search for truth. At night, when the world was asleep, Rana allowed herself the time to think. In the quiet darkness of her room, she would sit cross-legged on the floor, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The stillness was the only time she could hear her own thoughts, and that was when the inner conflict raged the hardest. During the day, she was the perfect daughter, obedient and respectful. But at night, her mind wandered to the forbidden knowledge. She had secretly studied the Christian texts, the stories of Jesus, the love that transcended boundaries, and the possibility of a world beyond the one she had always known. Rana had always believed that to question the teachings of her faith was a grave sin, a sin that could condemn her forever. But the more she prayed, the more she felt that her prayers fell on deaf ears. She had learned the rituals by heart, recited the words with devotion, but the peace she was supposed to feel never came. Instead, she felt increasingly isolated, as though her soul was drowning in the silence of her prayers. She had prayed for guidance, but the answers never came, and the frustration grew with each passing day. The spiritual vacuum she felt seemed endless, and she wondered if her faith was a hollow shell, empty and devoid of the warmth it promised. One evening, after hours of quiet meditation, Rana reached a breaking point. The usual stillness in her room felt oppressive. The darkness that surrounded her felt colder than ever. She knelt in prayer, as she had done countless times before. But this time, the silence was different. It pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She felt abandoned, disconnected from the very God she had spent her life praying to. It was in this moment of profound isolation that she first entertained the thought that perhaps her path was leading her somewhere else. It was a thought that both terrified and intrigued her. What if there was another way to find peace? What if the emptiness she felt could be filled by something else? Something beyond what she had always known. Rana's heart raced as she thought about the Christian texts she had secretly read. They spoke of a love so pure, so unconditional that it seemed to offer the very thing she had been searching for, a way to fill the void inside her. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of hope, but it was accompanied by a wave of fear. To embrace this new truth would mean risking everything: her father's wrath, her family's honor, her entire world. She would be walking away from everything she had been taught, everything she had believed in. But the thought of continuing her life in the same empty way seemed unbearable. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine when she felt so lost inside. Driven by a mixture of fear and longing, Rana made a decision. She would seek out the Christian church that she had heard about in whispers, a place hidden away from the eyes of the world. It was a dangerous decision, one that could have devastating consequences if anyone found out. But she could no longer ignore the call that had been growing louder inside her. The thought of entering a Christian church terrified her, but at the same time, it felt like the only step she could take to find the peace she so desperately needed. The church was tucked away in a secluded corner of the city, far from the bustling streets and the watchful eyes of her family. It was a place that had been kept secret for years, known only to a small group of believers who risked their lives to gather in its quiet sanctuary. As Rana approached the church, her heart pounded in her chest. She felt like a stranger in a foreign land, stepping into a world she had always been taught to fear. The building was old, with weathered stone walls that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. As she stepped inside, the air was cool, and the faint scent of incense hung in the air. The flickering candlelight cast shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of quiet reverence. Rana's eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of wooden pews and the simple altar at the front of the church. It was so different from the grand mosques she had visited throughout her life. The quiet beauty of the place made her feel both afraid and strangely at ease. She sat down on one of the pews, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. She had no idea what to expect, no idea what this step would mean for her life. But the quiet peace that filled the room seemed to welcome her, as though it was a place where she could finally be herself. As she sat there, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. She had come seeking something, but what was she really looking for? Was she truly ready to turn her back on everything she had known? The answer was unclear, but deep inside, she felt a growing certainty that this was the right step. The journey she had started, the inner awakening she had experienced, had led her here. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered a silent prayer. She didn't know what to say, but she knew that in this place, she could be honest with herself, even if no one else knew the truth. A quiet voice broke through her thoughts. It was the voice of the priest, soft and gentle, guiding her through the process. Rana listened intently as he spoke about the significance of baptism, the symbolic washing away of the old life and the embrace of a new one. The words resonated deeply with her, and she felt a strange peace settle over her. This was what she had been searching for. This was the moment of transformation, the moment when she would leave behind the world that had held her captive and step into a new life. Baptism itself was simple yet profound. As the priest poured the water over her head, Rana felt a wave of warmth and peace wash over her, as if she were being cleansed not just of the dirt of the world, but of the doubts and fears that had plagued her for so long. She felt a deep connection to something greater than herself, a love that embraced her fully, without judgment, without fear. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. As the ceremony ended, Rana stood in the quiet church, her heart full of a new sense of hope. She didn't know what the future held or how she would navigate the challenges that awaited her. But she knew one thing for certain. She had taken the first step toward her true self. She had left behind the shadow of her past and embraced the light of a new life. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Rana felt ready to face it. She had found a new hope, a new faith, and with it, a new purpose. The world outside the church may have remained the same, but within her, everything had changed. Rana returned home that night feeling lighter than she had ever felt in her entire life. The burden of constant tension, the weight of her father's expectations, and the years of unspoken doubt had suddenly lifted. The act of baptism had marked a profound shift within her. It was as though the chains that bound her had broken, and for the first time, she could feel the air of freedom surrounding her. The quiet church, the holy water, and the simple words of the priest had offered her something she had never thought possible, a way out of the prison of her past. Yet, despite this newfound peace, a sharp unease settled within her chest as she walked through the grand doors of her home. As Rana stepped inside the house, her heart pounded in her chest. The walls, that once seemed so comforting, the ornate furniture, the smell of incense and tradition, now felt suffocating. She had been there for years, but today, everything seemed foreign. There was no more safety within these walls, not after the decision she had made. Every step she took inside the house felt like it was echoing louder, as if the house itself was now a stranger to her. She had defied the very foundation of her existence, her religion, her father's authority, and her family's honor. The stillness of the night amplified the tension. Rena's mind raced with the consequences of her secret baptism. She knew that it was not just a personal choice. It was an act of rebellion in a world that punished such defiance. Her father, the general, was a man of absolute control, especially when it came to religious matters. To betray the faith he held dear, to publicly renounce Islam, would not only bring shame upon her, but would also bring irreparable disgrace to the entire family. Her father had taught her the importance of loyalty to him, to Islam, and to the traditions that bound them. To go against this meant risking everything, her freedom, her family, and her very life. Rena tried to convince herself that it was enough to keep her newfound faith hidden, that she could live in this duality, the faithful daughter by day and the hidden believer by night. She knew she could never openly defy her father. She couldn't imagine the consequences of such an action. She would keep her secret, she told herself. But as the days passed, she realized how difficult it was to keep up the charade. Her inner turmoil grew with every passing hour. She couldn't continue to live in this constant state of fear, hiding the most sacred part of herself. She began to wear a small cross around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes, a symbol of the new life she had embraced. It was a quiet rebellion, a personal testament to the transformation that had taken place within her. But the cross, however small and concealed, did not remain unnoticed for long. The fabric of her life was now unraveling, thread by thread. Her family, though they tried to maintain their strict observance of the rules, began to see subtle changes in her. It wasn't just the cross that gave her away. It was the way she carried herself, the way her eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence that was unfamiliar to her. She no longer cowered under the oppressive weight of her father's authority. There was something in her gaze, something defiant yet filled with a strange peace. Her father, the general, noticed the changes. He was not a man easily fooled. He had seen the way Rena moved through life, always cautious, always obedient, never questioning. Now, there was something different about her. He had raised her to be an extension of his own will, to be an obedient daughter who never strayed from the path. His suspicions grew as he watched her more closely. The small, hidden cross was the first sign, but it was her behavior that truly gave her away. She no longer bowed to his every word with the same unquestioning loyalty. There was a flicker of rebellion in her actions, in the way she now walked through the halls of their home, her head held high. It didn't take long for her father to discover the truth. It was a cold morning when he finally confronted her. He had received word from a trusted family member who had seen Rana at the church. His anger was like a thunderstorm. Rana's heart raced as she realized that the moment of truth had come. The world she had known, the life she had lived, was now on the precipice of collapse. Her father's eyes burned with fury as he looked at her. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. He had always been a man of control, of power. But in this moment, Rana saw something else in his eyes: betrayal. Not of her, but of himself. He had trusted her to be the one person who would never challenge his authority, the one person who would follow in his footsteps without question. But she had broken that trust. She had crossed a line that no one in their family had ever dared. Too crossed out, Rana stood before him, her body trembling, but her resolve firm. She knew what was coming, but she couldn't turn back. The decision had already been made, and she had to stand by it, no matter the cost. Her father's voice rose in anger as he demanded an explanation. His words were laced with accusation, betrayal, and the cold weight of disappointment. He could not understand how his own daughter could reject the teachings that had been passed down through generations, teachings that had shaped their very existence. To him, this was not just a personal act of faith, it was an insult to everything he held dear. Rana's heart ached with the knowledge that she could not explain herself in a way that would make him understand. How could she make him see that she wasn't rejecting him, but was instead searching for a truth that transcended everything she had been taught? How could she explain the peace she had found? The love that had filled her heart in a way nothing else ever had. It was impossible to articulate. She had known that the price of freedom would be high. But now, standing before her father, she felt the full weight of that cost. Her father's rage escalated. His anger was not just directed at her, it was directed at everything she had become. He could not accept that his own flesh and blood had defied the very foundation of their existence. He began to shout, his voice filled with venom and pain. The room seemed to tremble with his fury, and Rena felt as though she was being crushed beneath the weight of it all. The shame, the disappointment, the sense of betrayal, it all came crashing down on her in a single moment. In the days that followed, Rena was subjected to a form of punishment far worse than any physical harm. Her father, in his fury, had locked her away from the rest of the family. He ordered her to stay in her room, away from the world, away from everyone. The isolation was unbearable. She was left alone with her thoughts, her doubts, and the overwhelming fear of what might come next. Her father's wrath had not yet reached its peak, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before he would take further action. Rena's mind raced as she sat alone in her room. She had always known that embracing her faith would come at a price, but she hadn't fully understood the extent of it until now. The price of freedom was the loss of everything she had ever known. Her family, her reputation, her safety, all of it was now at risk. And yet, despite the pain and fear, Rena felt a deep sense of peace that had eluded her for years. She had taken a step toward the truth, toward a life that was her own, and no matter the cost, she would never go back. The price of freedom was not just the loss of her father's approval or the threat of exile from her family. It was the shattering of everything she had once believed to be true. But as the days passed in silence, Rena realized that she had made a choice that would change her forever. And no matter what came next, she knew she would stand by it. The days following Rena's baptism had been filled with an unbearable silence. The once grand halls of the family home now felt cold, and every step she took seemed like it echoed in the empty space between herself and her father. Her father's fury had not waned. He had always been a man of power, of absolute control. But now that control had taken a dangerous turn. Rena could feel the weight of his anger pressing down on her like a suffocating force. Every movement she made now under the watchful gaze of a man who had once been her protector, but now had become her captor. Her father, the general, was a man of rigid principles, and to him, his daughter's defiance was a betrayal that could not go unpunished. In his eyes, her refusal to follow the path he had meticulously planned for her was not just an act of rebellion. It was an affront to everything he had worked for, the years of service to the state, the family's honor, and the traditions that he had instilled in his children since birth. The notion that one of his own could step away from the faith they had always known was a wound so deep that he could not bear it. His pride, his reputation, and his standing in society were all tied to his family's unwavering loyalty to Islam. A defection like this threatened everything he had built. It wasn't just her faith that angered him, it was the humiliation. She had become a symbol of his failure, his inability to control even the most important person in his life. His world was one of order, where every action had a consequence, and every person knew their place. Rena's decision to walk away from that order had shattered everything. The more he thought about it, the more the rage festered inside him. He had raised her to be loyal, obedient, and above all, faithful to the traditions of their people. Her actions were a direct assault on that loyalty, and it left him no choice but to act in his mind. The punishment had to be severe, something that would break her spirit, force her to see the error of her ways, and bring her back into the fold. He couldn't allow this insubordination to go unchallenged. Not if he was to maintain his authority and his family's name. His punishment would be harsh, unforgiving, and meant to strip her of her will to resist. He thought that by doing so, he would restore his dignity and reclaim control over the situation. It was late in the evening when the tension reached its peak. Rena was summoned to her father's private study, a place where he often dealt with matters of great importance. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls, and the air inside felt thick, as though the very room itself was holding its breath. Rena entered with trepidation, her heart racing in her chest. She knew what was coming. She had known it for days. There was no turning back now. Her father stood at the desk, his face hard and set in a grim expression. His uniform, pristine as always, only accentuated the anger that radiated from him. He did not look at her at first. His eyes were fixed on a pile of papers, as if focusing on something so mundane could quell the storm inside him. But Rena could feel the weight of his gaze, even from across the room. It was a look she had seen many times in her life, the look of a man who had made up his mind and who would stop at nothing to impose his will. The general's voice broke the silence, low and menacing. He ordered her to kneel before him, a gesture meant to remind her of her place, of the power he held over her. There was no need for explanation. The punishment had already been decided. Her heart sank as she slowly sank to her knees, the cold, stone floor pressing against her skin. She could hear her father's footsteps as he walked around her, each step heavy with authority. He spoke to her, but his words were not those of a father concerned for his daughter. They were the words of a man who saw only failure, betrayal, and disrespect. His words cut deep, sharper than any physical wound. Rena braced herself for what was to come. She could feel her father's presence behind her, the tension in the air as thick as ever. She had always feared her father, but this was different. The man who had raised her with such strictness was now a stranger, a force of cruelty and anger. The hands that had once held her gently now hovered over her, ready to strike. And strike they did. The first blow landed with a sharp crack. Rena's head snapped to the side, the force of the slap sending a wave of dizziness through her. Her father had struck her before, of course every parent did. In his world, but never with such force, never with such purpose. It was as if he was trying to beat the very soul out of her, to make her forget the decision she had made. But instead of breaking her, the pain only seemed to fuel her resolve. She bit down on her lip to silence the cry that rose in her throat. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. The blows continued, each one harder than the last, until Rena's body trembled with pain. But her spirit remained unbroken. She could feel the sting of the strikes, the bruises beginning to form on her skin. But there was something else inside her now, a quiet strength, a quiet rebellion. The physical pain, while unbearable, was nothing compared to the fire that had been lit within her when she had been baptized. It was that fire that kept her from breaking, that kept her standing in the face of her father's rage. She had chosen this path, and no amount of physical punishment could take that choice away from her. The general's anger began to show signs of exhaustion. His strikes slowed, his breath coming in harsh gasps. He had expected her to break, to beg for forgiveness, to return to the path he had laid out for her. But instead, he saw only silence, Rena's unwavering silence. Her body was battered, her face streaked with tears, but there was a determination in her eyes that unnerved him. She wasn't fighting back. She wasn't resisting in the way he expected. Instead, she was enduring. Her eyes locked forward, never once pleading, never once asking for mercy. Her father, the great general, began to falter. The anger that had driven him to this point was now mixed with confusion and doubt. He had struck her with all his might, yet she remained defiant, her faith unshaken. He could not understand it. She should have broken by now. She should have fallen to her knees and begged for forgiveness. But Rena, despite her physical suffering, stood tall in her silence, refusing to bend. In that moment, the general's thoughts shifted. He began to wonder if she was right. What if she had chosen the true path? What if the faith she had embraced was the one that offered true salvation? His mind, once so certain, now grappled with a question he could not answer. His gaze softened, his anger waning as the realization settled in. For the first time, he saw his daughter not just as a disobedient child, but as a symbol of something far greater, something he could not comprehend. But before he could dwell on this thought, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. His hands, which had once been so sure, now trembled with guilt. He had broken her body, but in doing so, had he unknowingly started to break himself? Rena, though bruised and battered, did not collapse. She remained silent, her heart beating, strong in her chest, a testament to the strength of her spirit. Her father may have been able to strike her, but he could never strike down her faith. Rena stood at the window of her room, looking out over the familiar landscape of her family's estate, the garden, the meticulously trimmed hedges, the statues that adorned the yard. They all seemed distant, like the life she had once known. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her with every passing day. Her father's fury had not waned, and neither had his control over her. He watched her every move, making sure she had no chance to escape, to breathe freely, to exist beyond his reach. The idea of leaving, of starting anew, burned in her heart like a fire she couldn't ignore. But how? Where could she go? What could she do? Each night she lay awake, the shadows of the house pressing in around her, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She knew her only choice was to leave, to find a place where her faith would be accepted, where she could live without the suffocating grip of her father's expectations. But every attempt to find a way out seemed to end in failure. The world outside felt so far away, so unattainable. She couldn't escape, not yet. Her father was too powerful, his reach too long. He knew her every move, every whisper of her intentions. There was no place to hide. Her father, ever vigilant, had begun to notice the small signs of her restlessness, the way she had stopped engaging in the daily rituals, the subtle shifts in her behavior that told him she was not the same daughter he had raised. His anger had only intensified, and with it, his control over her became even more absolute. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, even when he was not in the same room. He was watching, always watching. The fear of what he might do next gnawed at her, but it was the fear of staying that grew even more unbearable. Every morning, as she knelt in prayer, a part of her rebelled against the familiar words, the familiar motions. It wasn't that she didn't believe in God. It was that her soul had already moved beyond the confines of the religion her father had imposed upon her. The prayers, once a comfort, now felt hollow. The rituals, once sacred, now felt like chains, shackling her to a life she no longer wished to live. Her heart longed for something else, something more. She had found it in her quiet moments of prayer, in the secret moments when she allowed herself to believe that there was more to life than the path she had been given. But now, trapped under her father's watchful gaze, that hope seemed impossible. Rana knew she could no longer stay in this house. The walls of the mansion that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. Her father's punishment had been brutal, but it was not the physical pain that tore at her, it was the emotional and spiritual suffocation that she could no longer endure. She was not just his daughter, she was his possession, a symbol of his power, and to lose her to her own faith was to lose his place in the world. He would not allow that. It was a cold morning when she began to make her plans. She knew that any attempt to leave would have to be swift, calculated. She had to find a way to escape, to leave behind the life she had been forced into, and find a place where she could finally be free. She thought of the countries she had studied, of the places where Christians lived openly, where the world was not governed by the laws her father had taught her to follow. She dreamed of freedom, of a life where she could walk without fear, where she could speak without being silenced. But as quickly as the thoughts came, she knew that her every move was being watched. She had to be careful. Every glance, every action could betray her intentions. And so, she began to hide her plans in the most subtle of ways. She started to gather information about passports, about visas, about any way out. But each step she took brought her closer to the realization that her father's power was too great. Her world had become too small, too restricted. He had already begun to restrict her movements even more. Her world, once filled with the freedom of youth, was now confined to the walls of this house, and the gates of that house were closing tighter with every passing day. Rana knew that escape would be impossible without help. She began to reach out in secret, looking for anyone who could help her. She researched organizations that helped refugees, Christian networks that assisted those fleeing persecution. But each search, each inquiry, seemed to lead her further into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. Her father had the means to track her every action, and even the smallest slip could lead to disaster. Her mother, once the quiet, obedient wife of a powerful man, had begun to notice her daughter's struggle. The woman who had always adhered to her husband's wishes, who had never questioned the traditions and duties that had been laid before her, now found herself torn between loyalty to her husband and her growing concern for her daughter. Rana's mother could not understand her daughter's choices, but she felt something stirring within her, a recognition that her daughter was reaching for something greater than the world they had known. But still, the mother could not find the courage to break free from the confines of her own upbringing. She could not find the strength to support her daughter in the way that she needed. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every day, Rana found herself walking on a razor's edge, caught between the world she had known and the world she longed to enter. The walls that surrounded her seemed to close in tighter. With each passing day, she could feel her father's eyes on her, his every move designed to ensure that she remained under his control. His anger had become something more, something that consumed the house, and even her mother, who once served as a shield between them, now seemed powerless to intervene. Rana could no longer wait. She knew that if she did not act quickly, she would be trapped here forever, bound by the laws and traditions of a life she no longer wanted. She had to leave, and she had to leave now. Her mind raced with the possibilities, but each option seemed to present more danger than the last. The escape was no longer just about fleeing the physical walls of her home, it had become about escaping the very life that had been forced upon her. One night, as she lay in her bed, the weight of the decision pressed down on her like a stone. She knew the risks, she knew what it would cost, but for the first time in her life, she felt the stirring of something stronger than fear, something like hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. She had to act before it slipped away. The next morning, Rana decided she would leave, no matter the cost. The walls of the house, once a symbol of safety, had become her prison, and so she began to prepare. She packed her belongings in secret, gathering only the essentials, the few clothes she could carry, her identification, and a small amount of money she had managed to save. Her heart raced as she worked in silence, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and determination. But as she moved through the house, preparing for the inevitable, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her father's presence was everywhere, a constant reminder of the world she was trying to escape. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she expected to see him standing there, his eyes full of accusation. But she could not let that fear stop her. She had made her decision. There was no turning back. As the night grew darker, she knew her time was running out. The world outside her family's walls seemed so distant, but it was the only place where she could be free. And so, Rana took her first step toward freedom. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she could no longer remain trapped in a life that was not her own. She had to go, no matter the cost. Rana had spent weeks planning her escape, every thought consumed with the desire for freedom, the need to break free from the oppressive grip of her father and the life she had been forced into. The decision to leave was not made lightly. Her life, once rich with privilege and luxury, now felt like a cage with golden bars. Each day spent under the ever-watchful eyes of her father had brought her closer to the realization that she could not remain in this world any longer. The world of tradition, control, and fear had slowly worn her down, until it became clear that the only way forward was to leave everything behind. The pain of betrayal, the fear of the unknown, and the terror of what her father might do if he discovered her plans were all-consuming. But the pull for freedom was stronger than the fear. Her escape was set in motion when she received an unexpected message from an underground Christian network, one that had helped many others like her. It was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness of her life. They had arranged for her to travel to Europe, where she would be offered asylum. It was her chance, perhaps the only one she would ever get, to start anew. But the reality of what she was about to do weighed heavily on her. She had to leave her family, her country, her entire life behind. Yet, as she packed her few belongings, a small bag containing a handful of clothes, her passport, and a few small tokens of her new faith, there was no turning back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she silently slipped out of the house, knowing that once she left, there would be no returning. The house, with its towering walls and guarded gates, faded behind her as she stepped into the unknown. The journey was long, and at times filled with doubt and fear, but as the plane lifted off the ground, carrying her away from the life she had known, she felt something stir within her, a sense of liberation. The city she had once considered a prison now seemed like a distant memory, fading into the past. Each mile between her and her father's home felt like a victory, a step closer to the freedom she had dreamed of for so long. When the plane landed in Europe, Rana could hardly believe it. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. The air felt different here, lighter, as if it breathed with possibility. She was free from the tyranny of tradition, from the stifling control of her father's expectations. She was no longer a daughter bound by honor and duty. She was an individual, a woman with her own hopes, dreams, and faith. In the safe house that had been arranged for her, Rana found peace, the kind she had not known in years. The nights were quiet, and she no longer feared being watched, no longer felt the crushing weight of her father's anger. Her heart, once filled with the noise of oppression, was now still. She could finally breathe. The simple act of walking down the street without fear of being followed, without the burden of being judged for her faith, felt like a miracle. For the first time in a long time, she could be herself. Her thoughts were her own, and her heart, which had been torn between duty and desire for freedom, now felt full. Rana spent her days adjusting to this new life, slowly finding a rhythm. She learned the language of her new country, navigated the complexities of her asylum process, and began to experience what it meant to live without the suffocating control of her past. But more than anything, she immersed herself in her faith, the faith that had kept her going through the darkest times, the light she had found in her beliefs, the peace that Jesus had brought to her heart, now felt like the foundation of her new existence. It was not just a new life she was living, it was a life of purpose, of love, and of service to those who, like her, had been trapped by tradition and fear. She found a sense of belonging among the Christian community in Europe. The people there welcomed her with open arms, offering her kindness and understanding. They knew the cost of faith, and they supported her in her journey of healing and growth. It was in their company that Rana began to understand the true meaning of grace, though unearned. unconditional love of God that had brought her to this point. She began to see that her suffering had not been in vain, that every tear, every moment of pain, had led her to this place of freedom. It was not just her physical escape that mattered. It was the spiritual liberation she had experienced. Her faith became the driving force behind her new life. She felt called to help others who, like her, had been trapped in oppressive systems, whether religious, familial, or societal. She became involved in outreach programs, helping others who had fled persecution or were struggling to find their place in the world. Rena's own journey of healing and transformation had taught her that the greatest gift she could give was love that transcended fear, that saw beyond the labels and the traditions that often divided people. She dedicated herself to serving others, offering a kind word, a helping hand, or simply a listening ear to those who needed it most. Through her work, Rena began to realize that the light she had found was not just for her. It was something to be shared, something to be spread to those still living in darkness. Her heart, once heavy with doubt and fear, was now overflowing with hope, and she felt a deep sense of purpose in helping others find the same peace and freedom that she had found, despite the distance, despite the freedom she now had. There were moments when Rena would think of her family. The pain of leaving them behind, the knowledge that they would never accept her new faith, lingered in her heart. But the more she reflected on her journey, the more she understood that she could not go back. The chains that had bound her in her father's house had been broken, and she was no longer a prisoner of his will. She had found her own path, her own truth, and she would walk it to the end. In the quiet of her new life, Rena began to realize that her journey was not just one of physical escape. It was a journey of spiritual awakening. She had been reborn, not just through the act of baptism, but through every choice she had made, every act of defiance against the life she had been forced into. Each day, she grew stronger in her faith, more certain of the love that surrounded her, more committed to the path she had chosen. For the first time in her life, Rena felt complete. The darkness that had once defined her existence was now gone, replaced by the light of a new beginning. She was no longer the daughter of a general, the obedient child bound by tradition. She was Rena, a woman with a future, a purpose, and a faith that could not be taken from her. And as she walked down the streets of her new city, free to live and love as she chose, she knew that the light she had found would guide her, no matter where life took her.